Tim, all my life I've wanted to know whether God exists, and I've heard all the different arguments back and forth, but sometimes I just sit back and say, wait a minute, what is this concept of God that I'm trying to figure out what exists? Nobody talks about that. Tell me, what is God?
Well, God is the simplest, in many ways, among the simplest concepts there is. God is just pure perfection. Trying to unpack that, it gets a bit complicated. We have the idea that God is the transcendent creator of all else, totally self-sufficient being, perfect in power, knowledge, goodness, these sorts of things. And trying to work through that notion, thinking about God's relationship to time, for example, can God undergo change? Then things get complicated. But at its core, the idea of God is the idea of pure perfection.
Why is that? Why does that have to be God? Why does God have to be perfect?
Good. Well, we can choose to use a term however we like, and ordinary religious people think of God in more intuitively accessible ways, think of God as a person like ourselves, only much more powerful, much more knowledgeable. And sometimes I think people even vaguely conceive God as some sort of large embodied human being, somehow outside of our immediate reality. The reason for thinking about God this way is because once you conceive God in this sort of philosophical notion as pure perfection, it gives rise to some interesting arguments that tie into the goal of trying to explain the world around us. It's not a very powerful sort of explanation to think of God as almost a sort of Greek powerful being, and so we need to leave that notion behind because it's a more fruitful notion to think of God in this way.
And so you really have two contrasting images. One is this transcendent perfection, and the whole gigantic universal universes. On the other hand, people see God as something very intimate to them personally, and answering prayer or whatever, however they communicate in their lives. And is that a contradiction?
There's a tension because philosophers and theologians have long thought of God in the way I've described as a perfect being, and that has led them to some very counterintuitive conclusions about the nature of God. For example, that God is utterly outside of time. That might sound like a harmless thing to say, but when you try to unpack that, you realize it means that there's no change of state in God. God doesn't first think this, then that, then some other thing. And so if God is somehow interacting with a human being, the person naturally thinks of himself as expressing some thought to God, and God in some measure responding to that, a sequence of events that God is bound up with. But if God is outside of time, there is no before and after. It's just one eternal now. So somehow this unchanging reality is interacting with a changing reality, but it's not changing itself. And that begins to seem very impersonal. Because
it's impersonal, and to some degree it seems impossible, because if right now God may know that Tim is sitting here, but an hour ago Tim wasn't sitting here, and did God know that? If God knew that then God has changed in God's knowledge in some way, right?
Sure. Can God know what time it is now? In part, the answer to that question it concerns the nature of time itself. If you think there's some fundamental fact of what's happening now, and this is a constantly changing fact, the future doesn't exist yet, the past is gone, and so reality is dynamic in that sense, that only what exists right now, then God it would seem his knowledge would have to keep track constantly of what's happening now as opposed to what previously happened. If you think past and future in some sense exist, they just don't exist where we are, in our not just spatial location, but our time location, then maybe it's a little easier to manage that.
The other properties you mentioned very quickly, all powerful, all knowledgeable, all good, free, these are a lot of words that are being thrown around. Is that the totality of what God is, or is there 1,000 different characteristics, or are there only 4?
Good. Right. We ascribe to God characteristics of power and goodness and knowledge, in part because they seem to us to be
perfections. That's a 3. I got a 3. Okay.
Right. And you might add, we might come up with another handful or so, but presumably...
But I won't need more than 2 hands.
I think that's right.
Okay. All right. In 2 hands I can encapsulate God. Is that what you're telling me?
You can encapsulate the extent of what we can conceive of God.
The core characteristics.
Right. But it might be that God has, Descartes, for example, famous philosopher, held that there was an infinity of perfections in God. And of course, we can't think of infinitely many sorts of properties, so essentially all of God's nature becomes unknowable to us, only the core attributes.
So are these core attributes, if there are an infinity or a very large number, are they reducible down to some core and then the rest are derivative? Are there some things that are absolutely essential to God, or are they all essential to God?
Good. So the core is perfection itself, and we might persuade ourselves that power is a very fundamental feature, right? The ability to make things happen. So it seems like if that's true of God, you know something pretty substantial about God. If God is a minded reality, a being having thoughts, purposes, in something analogous to the way that human beings have thoughts and purposes, that's a very important fundamental characteristic of God. There might be more esoteric, though, aspects of God that are equally essential to God's nature that we know nothing about, because there's nothing corresponding to it in our spatio-temporal, finite, limited reality in the way that there is something corresponding to power and knowledge and will.
Are these characteristics separable, or are they all kind of interwoven so together that you can't have one without the other?
I think the latter. I think there's a very good reason to suppose the latter, because if they were separable, then we would be able to ask questions. Well, why is God the way he happens to be if he might have been without this characteristic, or possibly with a characteristic he doesn't in fact have? But God, core to the idea of God for philosophical purposes, is as the ultimate buck-stopping explanation. And so if we conceive God in a way such that it gives rise to explanatory questions, then the concept falls apart.
So this is very interesting, so however we define God, we have to eliminate all explanatory questions beyond that.
That's right.
And if we haven't done that, that means we haven't done our job very well.
And
maybe we can never do the job well.
Yes, I think that's right. So it's almost, we're driven by our need for God to play a certain fundamental explanatory role in reflecting on the concept of God.
Okay.
We might take back something we might have thought was true of God if we see that this would undermine God's ability to play that role.
So is it fair to say you're defining God as an ultimate explanation, which is, I know,
Yes.
a book that you've written, and if you're unable to do that, that means you've fallen short in defining God, but you might, as a goal to define what God is, you could describe it in all these different adjectival descriptions, but you must get to an ultimate explanation. And God must be an ultimate explanation, or it's not God.
That's right, because arguably that's a more perfect way to be. Right. So again, if we go back to our fundamental core concept of pure perfection, other things being equal, to be the sort of being such that there's no dependency on something else that plays some explanatory role to you, that accounts for why you are as you are or why you exist. Arguably, that's a more perfect way to be. So if God is pure perfection, he would have to be that way.
And there's only one?
Yes, well, then we have to, yes, begin to think about the concept, could there be more than one perfect being of that sort? There are certain paradoxes at least seeming paradoxes that come up once we contemplate the idea that there might be more than one. So if you've got two perfect beings, both capable of creating, and they have different ideas about what they want to bring about, who wins? So this gives reason to think perhaps there could not be. You might even take this to be an argument for why there could not be two or more such beings.